Every great civilization that has ever existed asked the same question at some point. Where do we go from here? Not in a moment of obvious crisis, not when the barbarians were at the gates or the economy had collapsed or the plague had swept through. In the quiet moments, the moments when everything was still technically functioning, when the institutions were still open and the roads were still maintained and the currency was still accepted. But something underneath it all had changed, something in the quality of the thing. And the people who were paying attention could feel it even when they could not name it. The Romans felt it, not in 476 AD when the Western Empire formally ended, long before that. Juvenal felt it in the 1st century. Tacitus felt it. Marcus Aurelius felt it, a man who was simultaneously the most powerful person on earth and privately consumed by the question of whether what he was governing was worth the governing. He wrote his meditations not as a philosophical treatise for publication, but as private notes to himself, working through in real time the question of how to maintain integrity and purpose inside an institution he could see was beginning to rot. That is a specific feeling this video is about, not the dramatic collapse, the quiet rot, the sense that something underneath the surface has changed in a way the surface is not yet reflecting. The institution's still functioning, the form still maintained, but the animating force, the specific quality that made the thing worth having, going somewhere. Now, something personal before we go into the history, because I have been thinking about these questions a lot, talking to people my age, reading the comments on this channel, and your comments are genuinely some of the most interesting I have read anywhere. The conversations that happen under these videos are a different quality from what happens on most channels. People are clearly thinking, clearly paying attention, are increasingly the question underneath everything this channel covers: when is our time? When does the next golden age arrive? Because looking back across history, the Athenian Golden Age, the Italian Renaissance, the Victorian peak of British civilization, the American century, they were all preceded by periods that felt exactly like this one feels. Periods of confusion and contraction, and the sense that something had ended without anything clearly beginning to replace it. The people living through those periods did not know they were on the cusp of something. They knew the existing structures were failing, they knew the old answers were not working. They did not know what came next. That is where we are, in the gap, after the old structures have demonstrably failed and before whatever replaces them has become visible. And the question of what comes next is not answered by any historian or philosopher, it is answered by what you actually do. But understanding the pattern helps, because this is not the first time the Western world has been in this gap. It has been here before, multiple times, and the people who understood the pattern navigated it better than the people who did not. Let me take you through the thinkers who named what we are living through before it arrived. Polybius was a Greek historian writing in Rome in the 2nd century BC. He was watching the most successful republic in the ancient world at the height of its power, and he was already identifying the seeds of its inevitable decay in the structure of its success. He developed a theory he called anacyclosis, the cycle of governments. All governments, Polybius argued, cycle through 6 stages. Monarchy becomes tyranny when the king stops serving the public good and starts serving himself. Tyranny is overthrown and aristocracy emerges. Aristocracy degenerates into oligarchy when the ruling class stops serving the public good and starts protecting its own position. Oligarchy is overthrown and democracy emerges. Democracy degenerates when the population discovers it can vote itself benefits at public expense. When politicians compete to give more and ask for less. When the specific civic quality of democratic governance, citizens contributing to and participating in a shared project, collapses into consumers demanding the system deliver for them personally. And then democracy collapses into ochlocracy, mob rule, which produces such chaos that a strong leader emerges to restore order. And the cycle begins again. He wrote this 2,200 years ago, watching Rome and describing the exact mechanism that is producing the political landscape of the Western world in 2026 with uncomfortable precision. Every party in the current British political landscape is competing to promise more. Lower bills, more NHS spending, better public services. Nobody in mainstream British or American politics is standing up and saying what Polybius would have immediately understood, that the specific things being promised require the specific things nobody is willing to demand. That functioning public services require a civic culture of contribution, that democracy producing 7 prime ministers in 10 years, and, in America, a political class so captured by financial interests that the choice between parties increasingly resembles the choice between two brands of the same product and has lost the specific quality that made democratic governance worth having. The Roman Republic lasted approximately 500 years. It did not fall to external conquest. It collapsed from the inside through the specific mechanism Polybius described, the degeneration of democratic governance into the competition between powerful individuals for the support of a population that had been converted from citizens into clients. Julius Caesar understood this better than anyone and used it with extraordinary precision. His genius was not military, it was political. He understood that the Republic had already ended functionally, and that what remained was the performance of republican governance around a reality that was already something else. Now Spengler. Because Polybius diagnosed the mechanism, Spengler diagnosed the moment. Oswald Spengler published The Decline of the West in 1918, while the First World War was still being fought. A German philosopher who had spent a decade developing a theory of history that rejected the idea of linear progress in favour of something more uncomfortable. Civilizations, he argued, are like organisms. They are born, they grow, they reach a peak of creative vitality, and they decline. Not because of external pressure primarily, because of internal exhaustion. The creative energy that built the civilization runs out. What remains is the civilized shell, the institutions, the bureaucracies, the forms, without the animating force that made them worth having. He called Western civilization Faustian, after Faust, the man who sold his soul for knowledge and power. The West's specific genius is reaching further than any previous civilization had reached. The longest sea voyages, the highest cathedrals, the most ambitious science, the largest empires, and its specific tragedy is that this reaching eventually exhausts itself. The political form of the declining phase, Spengler argued, is the replacement of genuine democratic participation with plutocracy, the rule of money. Not kings, not aristocrats. Concentrated capital purchasing political outcomes without appearing to govern directly. His specific prediction, written in 1918, over a century ago, deserves to be read slowly. The era of individualism, liberalism and democracy, of humanitarianism and freedom, is nearing its end. The masses will accept with resignation the victory of the Caesars, the strong men, and will obey them. Is that not precisely the quality of the current moment? Not dramatic rebellion, resignation. The specific exhausted acceptance of a population that has made the calculation, consciously or not, that its participation in the shared project is not producing the outcomes it was supposed to produce. In Britain, Keir Starmer resigned, a replacement incoming that nobody directly voted for. In America, the political class is entangled in Middle Eastern military commitments nobody authorized. The resignation in both cases is total. People are watching, accepting, going back to their phones. Spengler argued this was not a catastrophe to be prevented, but a phase to be understood. That the attempt to restore genuine democratic participation at the civilization phase is like trying to restore spring in autumn. The seasons do not reverse. The question is not how to return to what was. The question is what to build in the conditions that actually exist. That is a very uncomfortable thought. It is also possibly the most honest thought available. Arnold Toynbee, a British historian of the 20th century who produced a 12-volume study of history attempting to identify the mechanism of civilizational decline across every major civilization in the historical record. His answer was different from Spengler's and in some ways more hopeful. Civilizations decline, he argued, because of a failure of creative response to challenges. Every civilization faces challenges. The civilizations that survive generate creative minorities, small groups with the capacity to identify what the challenge requires and produce a novel response. The civilizations that decline are the ones whose creative minorities have become dominant minorities, who use their position to maintain the existing order rather than to generate the creative response the challenge requires. The internal proletariat, Toynbee's term for the people inside a civilization who have been promised inclusion in its benefits and found that promise broken, who have done what was asked, got the education, paid the taxes, followed the rules, and found the return insufficient. The internal proletariat does not primarily rebel. It withdraws, stops identifying with the civilization, stops defending it, stops reproducing it. The data on young men withdrawing from the labour market, from family formation, from civic participation. That is not primarily a social problem requiring a policy solution. That is the internal proletariat behaving exactly as the internal proletariat always behaves when the dominant minority has stopped generating the creative responses that would give them a reason to stay. Toynbee argued that the civilizations which successfully negotiated the challenge of internal proletariat withdrawal were the ones that generated leaders capable of speaking honestly to the conditions producing that withdrawal. The civilizations that did not were the ones that maintained the performance of inclusion while the substance eroded, now the Byzantine parallel, because this is the one nobody uses and it is the most structurally precise. The Byzantine Empire was the Eastern Roman Empire, the half of Rome that did not fall in 476 AD. For nearly 1,000 years after the West fell, Constantinople functioned as the center of the most sophisticated state in the European world. Its legal system, its bureaucracy, its military, its architecture, all direct continuation of Roman institutional achievement at a level the post-Roman West took centuries to approach again. The Byzantine decline began in the 11th century. It lasted 400 years. What makes it the precise parallel for the current moment is not the external pressure, the Seljuk Turks, the Crusaders, the Ottomans, but the internal mechanism that made the external pressure decisive. Emperors rotated rapidly in the final centuries. The Angelid dynasty, which ruled Byzantium from 1185 to 1204, has been described by historians as one of the most unsuccessful and ineffectual administrations in the empire's history. Rulers unable to establish the authority needed to make lasting decisions, institutions functioning after they had stopped working, the forms of imperial governance maintained after the substance was gone. Byzantine emperors found it increasingly difficult to muster sufficient military forces. The defense of the empire depended on competent personal direction from the emperor. When the emperor changed every few years, sometimes every few months, the system that depended on that direction could not function consistently. 7 prime ministers in 10 years in Britain. The specific dysfunction of rapid leadership succession, each new leader unable to build the sustained authority required to make institutional decisions before being replaced, is documented in Byzantine history across its final 4 centuries. The people living through it did not experience it as decline. They experienced it as the normal operation of a complex state. What looked like continuity was actually contraction. By the time the contraction was undeniable, it was too late to reverse. Constantinople fell to the Ottomans in 1453. The Byzantine Empire had been technically functioning for 400 years of decline before that. The walls still stood. The Patriarch still performed his role. The Senate still met. The forms were intact. And then, one day, the forms were gone too. Gibbon documented the specific moment Rome stopped defending itself. Not a dramatic event, a gradual shift. Roman citizens had historically served in the legions as a civic duty. The legion was the expression of the Roman understanding that civilization required something from its members beyond the consumption of what it provided. As Rome grew wealthier and more comfortable, the willingness of citizens to perform that service declined. The army gradually became dependent on Germanic mercenaries, the foederati, who were effective fighters but who had no stake in the outcome. They fought for a wage. When the moment came that defending Rome required sacrifice rather than just a wage, the mercenaries were not available for sacrifice. The walls were unmanned not through military defeat, but through the slow erosion of the willingness to man them. Now the Venetian Republic, because this is the one that is closer to Britain and America structurally than Rome or Byzantium, and almost nobody is using it. Founded in the 8th century, lasted over 1,000 years, longer than Rome, longer than Byzantium, longer than any other continuous republic in European history. At its peak, Venice controlled trade routes from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, maintained the most sophisticated diplomatic service in Europe, and produced art and architecture that defined the culture of an entire continent. Its constitutional arrangements were extraordinary, a republic with elected leadership, complex checks on power, mechanisms for preventing any single family or faction from accumulating dominant control. It declined, not through military defeat, through the specific exhaustion of the merchant class that had animated it. The men who had taken the risks, sailed the dangerous routes, made the bold investments, opened the new markets, gradually gave way to a class of men who managed the wealth those risks had created without taking equivalent risks themselves. The Republic's institutions continued to function. The forms were preserved with extraordinary precision. But the animating force, the specific willingness to extend, to risk, to build something new, had gone. When a successful civilization produces a class of people whose primary goal is to preserve what has been built rather than to build further, the preservation eventually fails, because preservation without continued creation is just slow decay. The thing being preserved is not static. The world around it keeps moving, and the gap between the preserved form and the changed reality grows until it can no longer be managed. The specific parallel, the generation that owns the houses, the pension funds, the established positions, managing their preservation, while the generation that would be required to build further has been priced out and shut out and is withdrawing. The Venetian merchant class did not intend to hollow out the Republic. They intended to preserve it. The preservation strategy was the thing that made the hollowing inevitable. Now, the America angle specifically. Because this channel has a significant American audience, and what is happening in the United States is a different expression of the same underlying process, and it deserves its own examination. The US military and Israeli military are now operating with a degree of strategic integration that has no democratic mandate. Nobody in the American electorate was asked whether they wanted American military assets entangled in the specific strategic objectives of the Israeli state in the Middle East, in the way they currently are. The Iran situation, oil above $100, the Strait of Hormuz closing and reopening under pressure, British jets in Syrian airspace without a parliamentary vote, the question of what the end state of this entanglement looks like and who benefits, these questions are not being answered in public with any honesty. Polybius would recognize this immediately. The Roman Republic's final decades featured exactly this: military commitments made without genuine popular consent, financed by concentrated wealth, serving interests that were never honestly described to the population being asked to support them. The First Punic War was sold to the Roman people as a defensive necessity. By the Third Punic War, the war that ended with Carthage literally destroyed and salt ploughed into its fields, the question of whose interests the war was serving had become considerably more complicated. The American political class is in its Punic War phase, the population is in its Roman citizen phase, watching, accepting, going back to its screens. Spengler predicted that the specific political phenomenon of this phase would be the emergence of Caesarism, leaders who bypass the deliberative mechanisms of democracy to deliver direction to a population that has resigned itself to not having genuine input. Trump is not Caesar, but Trump is the symptom Spengler described, the product of a democratic system that has lost the internal coherence required to govern itself through its own deliberative mechanisms. The population gravitating towards someone who speaks directly and forcefully is not irrationality. It is the exhausted resignation of people who have watched the deliberative mechanisms fail for decades and are looking for something that at least appears to move. Whether the Caesarism that is emerging produces something better or something catastrophically worse than what it replaces depends entirely on who the Caesars are and what they do with the mandate. History provides examples of both. Now, something more personal, because this video is supposed to be a conversation and I want to be direct with the people watching. And I go to London sometimes and you notice it immediately, the homelessness, people sleeping in doorways in the capital of one of the wealthiest countries in history, the smell in certain underground stations, the litter on streets that nobody picks up because nobody feels responsible for them, the sense of a place where the shared space, belonging to everyone and therefore to nobody, has been allowed to deteriorate because the specific social fabric that once maintained it has been pulled apart. Communities maintain shared spaces when the people in them feel a stake in the space, when the community is large and anonymous and transient, when nobody knows their neighbours, when everyone is just passing through on their way to somewhere else. The maintenance stops. The sense of this is my place, and I am responsible for it has been replaced by this is just where I happen to currently be. I talked to my parents about all of this. They said that when they were young, the sense that things could be changed through political action was real. Not naive. Real. You could see the connection between what people organise around and what the political system delivered in response. That connection has weakened to the point where large numbers of people have made the rational calculation that participation is not worth the investment. This is what Polybius described as the degeneration of democracy, not into dictatorship, into irrelevance, into a system that continues to perform the rituals of democratic participation, while the actual decisions are made by forces the rituals do not effectively constrain. But this is not where the video ends, because this is not a doom video. Polybius identified the cycle. He also identified that it is not perfectly deterministic. Rome produced Scipio Africanus, the general who defeated Hannibal, rebuilt the Roman military, and gave the Republic another 2 centuries. Not because the cycle was wrong, but because within the cycle there are people who respond to the challenge with sufficient creativity and force to delay and sometimes redirect the trajectory. Toynbee identified the dominant minority and the internal proletariat. He also identified that the civilizations which survive are the ones that produce a response from within. A new creative minority, not from the existing institutions, often from outside them. The people building the alternative rather than waiting for the existing structure to repair itself. Spengler does not offer much hope of reversing the civilizational trajectory. What he does offer is the insight that individuals within a declining civilization are not therefore condemned. The Roman citizen in the 4th century, aware or unaware of what was coming, still had the choice of how to live within those conditions, what to build, what to maintain, what to pass on. The radical individualism that has produced so many of the problems described in this video is not the answer. Toynbee was clear. The civilizations that survive generate creative minorities, not just resilient individuals. The creative minority is a group, people acting together around shared purpose, not the atomized individual optimizing for personal outcomes in a system that has no coherence. Something more like what communities used to provide. The specific sense that you are part of something larger than yourself, that places obligations on you and provides something in return. Build your own financial independence. Build genuine community with people you trust. Build your physical health. Build the specific capabilities that make you resilient, regardless of what the larger structures do. These are not small things. They are the individual components of the collective capacity that Toynbee identified as the creative minority that every civilization in transition has needed. Your parents' generation built something, imperfectly, with consequences that their children are now living with, but they built. The question is what your generation builds, not through the broken mechanisms of the existing system, through whatever community, capability and purpose you can construct in the actual conditions of 2026. In 200 years, people will look back at this moment. They will either look back at it the way we look back at the late Roman Republic, a period of democratic decay that produced the conditions for what came next, the last moment when a different outcome was still possible. Or they will look back at it the way we look back at the years before the Italian Renaissance, the confusion and contraction that preceded something extraordinary. The Venetian Republic lasted 1,000 years, not because its problems were smaller, because enough of its people, enough of the time, were willing to engage with those problems honestly, and to build responses from within the conditions they actually faced. I do not know what Britain or America looks like in 20 years, in 30 years, in 100 years. Nobody does. Polybius did not know what Rome would become when he was writing. Spengler did not know what post-war Europe would look like. The Byzantines in the 11th century did not know they had 400 years of managed decline ahead of them. What they knew was what they could do in the conditions they faced, what they valued, what they were willing to work for, what they were willing to pass on. The walls do not man themselves, they never have. Where do we go from here? That is for you to decide, and the answer starts with you deciding to take the question seriously. There is one more historical parallel worth sitting with before we get to the close, the Spanish Empire, because it is the most recent example of a Western civilization at peak power that entered a decline so gradual that the people inside it largely did not notice until it was complete. In 1500, Spain was the most powerful nation on earth. It controlled the Americas. Its silver mines in Potosi and what is now Bolivia were producing more wealth than the entire rest of the world combined. The Spanish Navy was the greatest military force on the seas. Spanish literature, art and architecture were defining European culture. The Spanish Empire stretched from California to Patagonia, from the Philippines to the Caribbean, from the Netherlands to Naples. By 1700 it was a secondary power. By 1900 it had lost virtually everything: the Americas, the Philippines, Cuba. By 2000 it was a member of the European Union with an economy smaller than California's. What happened in between was not military defeat primarily. It was the specific economic pathology that the historian David Landes called the Golden Curse. The silver from the Americas produced such enormous and immediate wealth that Spain never developed the productive economic base that creates sustainable long-term power. Why build factories when the silver ships are coming? Why develop agriculture when you can buy food? Why educate your population in productive skills when the treasure fleet makes education seem unnecessary? The wealth was real, the power it bought was real, and the specific thing it destroyed, the habit of productive work, the culture of building, the willingness to develop capability rather than simply extract resource, was the thing that would have sustained Spain's power beyond the moment the silver ran out. The silver ran out applied to the current moment, the specific economic pathology of financialization. Why build factories when you can make more money moving money around? Why invest in productive capacity when financial engineering produces better quarterly returns? Why develop your domestic workforce when you can import cheaper labor? The golden curse in its 21st century form. The wealth is real. The power it buys is real. And the specific thing it is destroying is the productive capacity, the working culture, the habit of building that would sustain the power beyond the moment the financial engineering stops working. At some point the financial engineering stops working. It always has. The domestic American situation specifically. The United States is carrying $36 trillion in federal debt. That number is almost meaningless at this scale. It does not produce an intuitive response the way a household debt figure does. What it means practically is that the United States is spending approximately $1 trillion a year just on interest payments on its existing debt, more than its defense budget. The specific flexibility that allows a country to respond to crises, to spend when spending is needed, is being consumed by the cost of previous spending. The room to maneuver is shrinking. The Roman parallel is precise. The Roman state, in its final decades, was spending so heavily on maintaining its military commitments, the foederati, the frontier fortifications, the bureaucratic apparatus, that it had lost the fiscal capacity to invest in the things that would have addressed the underlying causes of its vulnerability. The spending was real, the outcomes were real, and the specific thing the spending was destroying was the fiscal space to do anything other than maintain the existing structure at ever-increasing cost. Spengler described this as the specific characteristic of the civilization phase, the progressive consumption of the civilization's resources by the maintenance of the forms it has built, leaving nothing for the creation of new forms. The maintenance eats the creation until there is nothing left to maintain. These are not comfortable thoughts. They are also not hopeless thoughts, because the specific lesson of every civilization that has navigated a period like this one is not that decline is inevitable. It is that what matters in the gap between the old structures failing and the new ones becoming visible is not primarily political. It is personal and communal. What you build, who you build it with, what you are willing to sacrifice for and what you refuse to let go of. The Athenian Golden Age was preceded by the Persian Wars, the most existential external threat Athens had faced. The Italian Renaissance was preceded by the Black Death, the most catastrophic loss of life Europe had experienced since Rome. The Victorian peak of British civilization was preceded by decades of poverty, child labour, and industrial squalor that makes the current moment look comfortable. None of the people who built those golden ages knew they were building them. They were responding to the conditions in front of them with the resources available to them. Building what could be built, maintaining what was worth maintaining, teaching what needed to be taught. In 200 years, people will look back at 2026, whether they look back at it as the late Roman Republic, the last moment when a different outcome was possible, or as the Italian city-states in the 1340s, the confusion before the explosion of creative energy depends entirely on what the people alive now actually do. History does not produce golden ages on its own. People produce them, usually without knowing that is what they are doing. The question is what you are doing